The object I'm going to focus on is the Geographia, next slide, by Francesco Berlinghieri, which is perhaps the largest book in the exhibition in terms of actual dimensions, although some of the others seem to have a lot more pages. For those who have seen the exhibition, you may remember it in an individual case on the second floor on the front side of the building. The book is open to the world map, which you see here. The book is actually called the Sette Giornate di Geographia, the 7 days of geography, by Berlinghieri, who was a Florentine, and the book was published in Florence in 1482. Note this is 1482, 10 years before Columbus sailed westward, hoping to find a sea route to the Far East. So for obvious reasons, the world contains only the 3 continents, Europe, Africa, and Asia. On the screen now, new slide, next slide, is a hand-painted illumination, next slide, in the initial letter of the book. Wait a minute, no, can you go back? Sorry. Right. It's a printed copy of the book, although it's not Yale's example. It's not a manuscript, but in fact, it was quite common in the early days of printing to embellish printed books with manuscript illuminations. Yale's example, however, doesn't have any such illuminations. The writer is meant to be understood as Berlinghieri. Francesco Berlinghieri, born in 1440, was a silk merchant, apparently making good money from that. His family had been prominent in Florence for at least 200 years. An ancestor had helped broker a treaty between Florence and Siena in 1201, and many members of the family served as priors of the Signoria, which is the ruling body in Florence, from the 14th to 16th centuries. Francesco himself held a number of government offices, and between 1479 and 1481, he was ambassador to Mantua. He was a friend of Lorenzo, next, de' Medici, called the Magnificent. But his heart seems to have been in literary endeavors. In 1470, he was one of 4 men who set up the first Florentine printing company. And it's been said that Berlinghieri was the driving force behind this enterprise. The other 3 were a stationer who would provide paper and maybe a physical space, a banker, and a painter named Piero del Massaio, who is known as a painter of manuscript maps. Berlinghieri was a student of the notable humanist philosopher Cristoforo Landino, next slide, and a friend of Marsilio Ficino. Now at the left, you see Federico da Montefeltro with Landino, and on the right, you see Federico with his son Guidobaldo. So Berlinghieri is a student of Landino and a friend of Marsilio Ficino, another well-known Florentine philosopher. Berlinghieri himself implied that he had begun work on the Geographia in the 1460s, when he would have been in his 20s, which would correspond with the youthful aspect of the person in the initial letter author portrait, if we can call it that. He is known to have written in a letter in September 1476 that he intended to visit Conrad Sweinheim, a German printer in Rome, who Berlinghieri had heard was working on a printed geography, although it's not known if he actually did make that visit. The Geographia includes 123 folios of text and 31 engraved maps. The world map I showed at the beginning, plus the 10 maps of Europe. Next slide. This is the 10th. Now, what I'm showing are largely maps in color because, frankly, on the internet where I found a lot of these images, mostly the colored ones are included rather than black and white. But anyhow, they are actually easier to read. So 10 of Europe, 4 of Africa, and 12 of Asia. That were the standard number and distribution of maps in manuscripts and editions of Ptolemy's Geographia, sometimes titled Cosmographia, which of course is a grander title as it refers to the whole cosmos rather than only the Earth. And Ptolemy was an astronomer as well as a geographer. The edition that Swinheim indeed was preparing in Rome, and which was published in 1478, was titled Cosmographia. Additionally, next slide, Berlinghieri included 4 more maps, modern ones of Spain, France, and France is on the screen, Italy, and the Holy Land, to bring the total to 31. Claudius Ptolemy, next slide, please, who lived from the years 90 to 168 in Alexandria, wrote his famous geography around the year 150. And this portrait is one that was in the famous studio of Federico da Montefeltro, who was the Duke of Urbino. There are many portraits of eminent men. This book provided instructions for drawing a world map. Literally, Geographia means drawing the Earth, and a method for partitioning it into regional maps. A large part of his book consists of a table of longitudes and latitudes for some 8,000 towns, borders, and natural features. For about 1,400 years, this book remained the most accurate account of the geography of the world. A manuscript of it was discovered in a Greek monastery and was brought to Florence toward the end of the 14th century. Exactly when and why and by whom isn't clear, but Manuel Chrysoloras, a Byzantine scholar who taught Greek in Florence from 1397 to 1399, introduced it in his classes, and by 1406, Jacopo Angeli di Scarveria had translated it from Greek into Latin. Ptolemy, by the way, underestimated the Earth's landmass by about 30%, and overestimated the size of Asia, and thus Columbus and many others thought the westward voyage across the Atlantic to Asia would be relatively short. Manuscript versions of Ptolemy began to be made shortly after the arrival and translation of the text, some with maps drawn following Ptolemy's instructions. But the first printed edition was not made until 1475 in Vicenza, and that one had no accompanying maps. So the first printed version with maps, next slide, was published in Bologna in 1477 with engravings by Taddeo Crivelli. This actually was the very first book with engraved rather than woodcut illustrations. Now, woodcuts, as many of you know, and the groups of letters forming words are both images in relief and are both printed on the same kind of press, whereas engravings in which the lines forming the image are incised into a metal plate, so that the paper has to undergo a lot more pressure to pick up the ink in the lines, thus require a different kind of press. So making a book with engraved illustrations is a much more complicated project than one with woodcuts. The Bologna edition was followed very quickly by the Roman edition in 1478. And the text of both of these was Ptolemy's text in the Latin translation of Jacopo de Angeli, which may have undergone some modifications, but it essentially was still that translation from the very early part of the 15th century. Now, it may seem odd that it was to Florence, a landlocked city, rather than Venice, the bustling cosmopolitan port on the Adriatic, of which Marco Polo and his family were citizens, and from which voyagers like Bernard von Breidenbach departed in 1483 on his pilgrimage to the Holy Land. The book recounting this voyage is also in the exhibition. It may seem odd that the most famous ancient text on geography was brought to Florence and translated there. But Florence was the intellectual capital of Italy, home of Dante, next slide, in the 13th century. Wait a minute, there should be a picture. Oh, I guess we just missed that one. So could you go to the next? That's the Rome book. Dante in the 13th century. So that's Dante in the front. Boccaccio in the 14th, and Landino and Ficino, as mentioned above. Also Leonardo Bruni and others in the 15th. This is a painting by Vasari of about 1544, showing Dante and Petrarch and Boccaccio and others. So Berlinghieri grew up in this intellectual atmosphere, like all educated Florentines of his day, thoroughly versed in classical history, literature, and mythology. What Berlinghieri wanted to do in his book was to combine his knowledge of these classical humanistic subjects with the classical science provided by Ptolemy, and present it all in the modern vernacular language. His text is a poem in Italian, in terza rima, as was Dante's great Divine Comedy. And some of you may remember Kristen mentioned last week in connection with Dante's La Sfera that there were numerous Italian geographical books written in verse. Berlinghieri's poem was divided into 7 books as opposed to the 8 of Ptolemy's, thus bringing in a religious echo of the 7 days of creation. And the book is by no means entirely secular, but it has many Christian references. Just as Berlinghieri was combining humanism and science, he was also trying to fuse classical and Christian worldviews, if I might use that expression. Berlinghieri also included the lists of places found on the maps that were an essential component of Ptolemy, and Berlinghieri made it helpful for his readers by putting these lists in alphabetical order. Again, as in Dante's work, the poem was cast in the form of a journey, in this case, guided by Ptolemy himself. Now, the contemporary to us, author of a book focusing on the Berlinghieri work, wrote the following, quote, "A didactic poem in rhyming verse based on ancient models and demonstrating a virtuosic blending of modern and classical sources ranging from history to mythological verse must have had tremendous appeal for an influential coterie of European humanists." I myself admit to a bit of skepticism about the tremendous appeal, even for the influential coterie of humanists. But in any case, the author continued, the exclusivity that anchored Berlinghieri's intellectual network, and from which it derived much of its prestige, simultaneously cut against the work's attractiveness to many not in the know. While this presented no significant challenge to manuscript making, the novel technology of the press, the relative ease with which many copies could be made, sometimes encouraged the production of print runs that were larger than this limited pool of readers could sustain. End quote. In other words, the book didn't sell. Another writer who studied the typography of the book was more direct, writing that the book was, quote, sumptuous but with sparse success. So if we compare, next slide, compare the demand for Swinheim's Cosmographia 1478, and this is its world map, the one published in Rome. That one was reprinted in 1490, 1507, and 1508. And by comparison, it seems clear that Berlinghieri's book never gained popular appeal. There was what technically could be called a second edition, published maybe around 1516 by the Giunti family of publishers who were in Venice but were originally Florentine. Copies of the book printed at that time are distinguishable by the addition of a title, next slide, on the first page, printed in red. So this is that page from the example in the New York Public Library. Turning now to the book itself and its actual visual material, the 31 maps, it seems to me there are two basic questions. The first is, what are the models on which the engravings were based? And second, who was the engraver? The author of the book on the Geographia listed half a dozen manuscripts in Florence, Paris, and Rome that he wrote were probable, that was his word, sources for elements of the maps. But he didn't specify particular maps in those manuscripts that the printed maps match up with. So it's hard to know if his statement is based in something quite solid or is simply the received wisdom. The eminent cartographic historian Chet Van Duzer, who gave the terrific talk in this series about the Martellus map some weeks back, published an article in 2015 about a Ptolemy codex in the New York Public Library, which provides a cautionary note. He wrote, attention has been paid in the last few decades to the reception of Ptolemy's geography in the Renaissance. Less notice has been taken of the maps in that work, particularly as regards the relationships between specific manuscripts and specific printed editions. The Codex Ebnerianus in the public library is a case in point. I here argue that this manuscript was not the basis of copperplate maps in the Rome 1478 edition of the Geography, as was suggested by Joseph Fisher in 1912, and has been accepted apparently unquestioned since. Van Duzer went on to point out numerous places where the maps differ, clearly proving that the manuscript is not the model for the 1478 printed maps. And also proving that scholars sometimes tend to give too much credence to earlier work by other scholars, especially renowned ones. And of course, the longer erroneous information goes unquestioned, the less likely it is to get re-examined. In this case, it took 103 years. I don't know enough about the manuscript maps on which the engravings in Berlinghieri's book might have been based to make any suggestion at this point, although actually trying to ascertain that could be a fascinating and rewarding search. I do, however, have the name of a possible engraver. I am, after all, print curator, although I should say that some scholars discount this idea. But my thought follows a suggestion made by Arthur Hind, keeper of prints at the British Museum in 1938. Hind wrote, if it were not for the fact that Francesco Rosselli only returned to Florence from his Wanderjahre in 1482, it would be tempting to think that he had been engaged on Berlinghieri's atlas. Francesco Rosselli was a Florentine who later in life was publicly identified as a cosmographer and who is known to have engraved about 20 maps, of which examples of a dozen different ones still exist, although many unique or in extremely small numbers. Two of these, one made in 1506 and the other in 1508, which I'll show you later, are signed. Unfortunately, no other signed work of his is known. Francesco made perhaps 100 other engravings of figural subjects, but none of these is signed or dated. Rosselli was born in 1448, and thus he was 8 years younger than Berlinghieri, into an artistic family. His older half-brother Cosimo, next slide, was one of 5 painters invited in the early 1480s by Pope Sixtus IV to decorate the walls of the new papal chapel. So the blue arrow shows a what is presumed to be a self-portrait of Cosimo. And what is interesting here also is up in the upper right, you see a wind head, such as you see on maps. So it seems possible that Cosimo had just seen something that Francesco had done with wind heads and had thought this was a good thing to put into this image in the Sistine Chapel. Where am I? Oh, yes, this is the same chapel where several popes later, Julius II asked Michelangelo to paint the ceiling. Engraving was in its infancy along with Francesco, but it became more widely practiced in a few places, and Florence was among them. Francesco's first known work in the early 1470s was as a miniaturist. And in fact, he's known to have made miniatures for 2 manuscript Ptolemies. The precise skills of a miniaturist really coincide to a high degree with those needed for the exacting work of engraving. It's not known when he began engraving, but if my hypothesis is correct, that would have to have been during the 1470s. And in fact, he would have to have finished the 31 maps by the end of the 70s, because in 1480, his brother reported on his tax document that Francesco had gone off to Hungary to work for King Matthias Corvinus, leaving his wife, 3 children, and mother, Cosimo's stepmother, in Cosimo's care. Francesco didn't return until 1482, the year the Geographia was published, and there would not have been time to do all that engraving in that year. You'll remember that Berlinghieri founded a printing company in 1470, and one of the partners was the map painter Piero del Massaio. Florence was not all that big, and Piero would most probably have known the Rosselli family, and in fact, Berlinghieri might well have known them too. Cosimo, born in 1439, was just a year older than Berlinghieri. Some of Francesco's earliest prints were probably the series, next slide, of 24 prophets and 12 sibyls. I show just one of each, which these actually were copies of an earlier series by a less competent engraver. Now, I fantasized that Berlinghieri saw these and perhaps a few other prints that Francesco made during the first half of the 70s, and asked Francesco if he would take on the task of engraving the maps for the Geographia. In my fantasy, Francesco responds, "Perché no? Why not?" with all the enthusiasm of a strong, self-confident young man in his mid-20s, looking forward to some well-paying work. Now, map scholars have indicated that they think the maps were done by 1479, which works with the timing of Francesco being in Hungary in 1480, and of course also deals with Arthur Hines' objection. Now, a good number of the maps, next slide, are not particularly densely covered with lines, like this one, which is the 8th map of Europe. So my rough estimate of the time it would have taken to engrave them all is perhaps 15 months. In other words, that perhaps 2 could be done in a month. Could I, next slide, please? this is the modern map of Palestine. So even if it took 2 years or stretched out over 3, since we know that Berlinghieri had been planning the project for a long time, a longer stretch during the 70s would not have been impossible. During the 1480s, Francesco engraved a view of Florence next, to be printed on 6 sheets of only this one, which is the upper left corner, survives in an institution in Florence. Some of the other figural subjects he did were the 6 triumphs. Next slide. Petrarch. These are the first 2, the triumph of love and the triumph of chastity, and a 15-plate series of the mysteries of the Rosary. Next slide. On the left, you see some frame segments that were meant to be cut out and put around the individual images of the 15 series. You've got the Nativity on the right here. And next slide. This shows you a black and white and then a colored image of the same subject, the crucifixion. And then during the later 1480s, he engraved a view of Rome, which was to be printed on 12 sheets. The total would have measured about 3 by 6 feet. No example of any sheet of this, however, is known to survive. But in a figural subject, next please, he engraved around that same time, following a design by Botticelli. He inserted a glimpse of Rome, and perhaps you can discern it just in the middle. Most probably similar to part of the large view. Around that time, well, actually it's not known when, but he also made maps of Pisa and Constantinople, but like the one of Rome, unknown today. Francesco came under the influence of the preacher Savonarola, the next slide, who ruled Florence briefly toward the end of the century before the city turned against him and he and 2 of his colleagues were put to death. This image shows the 7 works of mercy. And next slide, I've got a detail of it where I hope you can see that there's a map of Italy off in the distance. If you have very good eyes, you can perhaps see Naples and Rome and Florence and Venice pointed out. Not too long after the death of Savonarola, Rosselli sold his house to the Dominicans, who put a convent on the site, which Francesco's 3 daughters entered. His one son took over his shop, and Francesco left for Venice. And it was in Venice in 1508 that Francesco attended a lecture on Euclid given by Fra Luca Pacioli. Next slide. Oh, that's Pacioli in the friar's garb. When the lecture was published, a list of those who attended was included, and Franciscus Rosellus Florentinus Cosmographus was on it. And another later Venetian document also calls him a cosmographer. So here are the 2 maps, and I'm getting to the end. Next slide, please. This is the 1506 map called the Contarini world map, because the name of a Venetian Contarini is on the map along with Francesco's name. And next slide is circa 1581. So this is obviously a colored example. it may be the only one. I've forgotten if there's more than one of this, but anyway, as I said, all of the maps, if they exist at all, exist in very few examples. So although it's possible, it would be possible to make comparisons of these with the Berlinghieri maps using reproduced images, ideally an example of the Berlinghieri could be put on the same table with each of these and close comparisons made. Although, of course, you have to take into account that 30 years intervened from the Berlinghieri and these maps. At any rate, I do hope to have a chance to dig more deeply into all of this in months to come. And thank you for your attention.